His name was Raymond Dale Buckner, and for 53 years he told no one, not his wife, not his children, not the priest who administered last rites in the summer of 2000. He had been told not to. He had been told clearly by men in uniforms he had not seen before and could not account for afterward, that what he witnessed in the early hours of July 8, 1947, at a facility adjacent to Roswell Army Air Field in New Mexico, was a matter of national security. Those were the words, a matter of national security. He was 24 years old, a licensed Army medic attached to the 509th Composite Group, and he had already seen things during his service that a man learns not to discuss in polite company. What happened in that room was different. What happened in that room followed him for the rest of his life in the way that only true things follow a person, not as a story he repeated, but as a weight he carried, distributed so evenly across his years that those who loved him never saw it until the very end, when he finally put it down. Buckner's account did not reach researchers until the winter of 2001, several months after his death in Albuquerque, New Mexico. His daughter, Patricia Buckner Cross, contacted a civilian researcher named Howard Elias Tate through a small publication that had run a piece on Roswell medical personnel. She had, she told Tate, a tape recording. If you're enjoying this story so far, don't forget to hit the like button and subscribe. Drop a comment telling me where in the world you're watching from. I love hearing from you. Her father had made it in the summer of 1999, alone, on a portable cassette recorder he had asked her to bring during one of her visits. He did not explain what he wanted it for. He did not tell her what was on it when he returned it to her the following afternoon. When he died the following spring, the recorder was in the drawer of his bedside table, the tape still inside. It had been recorded on both sides. The recording runs approximately 4 hours and 20 minutes. Tate, who documented his findings in a self-published monograph distributed to a small network of researchers in 2003, describes the audio as clear for the equipment, Buckner speaking slowly, with long pauses, doubling back often on small details of chronology, with the precision of a man rehearsing testimony he never intended to give. What Patricia heard when she finally played the tape is not fully described in Tate's account. He notes, with evident discretion, that she told him the recording had disturbed her in ways she found difficult to name, and that certain passages required multiple listenings before she could accept that it was her father's voice saying the words. The relevant portion runs approximately 40 minutes, beginning on the second side of the tape, roughly 3 minutes in, and ending without a sign-off or closing statement from Buckner. It describes the night of July 8, 1947. It describes a room, and it describes, in the careful and reluctant language of a man who has held something too long and is finally tired, what he heard in that room before morning came. Buckner was summoned at approximately 2:15 in the morning. His account specifies the time because he checked his watch when the knock came, a habit from his service years he had never managed to drop. The knock was from a superior officer, a colonel whose name Buckner provides on the tape, but which Tate withholds in his monograph, citing a request from the colonel's surviving family. Buckner was told to bring his kit. He was not told why. The building he was taken to was one he had not been inside before. He describes it as a low prefabricated annex, unlit from the outside, set back from the main medical facility by perhaps 70 yards. Inside, the lighting was bright, operating room bright, he says, but the room itself was not an operating room. No surgical tables, several standard military cots. On one of them, under a white sheet, was something that was not a man. He had been briefed on what he would find. The briefing was short. An aircraft accident, he was told. Some of the occupants had survived the initial impact. His job was to monitor vital signs and report any changes. He was not told that the occupants were not human. He understood this within the first seconds of entering the room. It was small. That is the first thing Buckner says on the tape. Perhaps 4 feet in height, thin in a way that suggested the bones were structured differently from his own, with a head notably large relative to its narrow shoulders. The skin was a pale grey, slightly luminous under the overhead lights, with a texture he describes as smooth and without visible pores, like the surface of something that had spent no time in weather or sun. The eyes were closed. He could tell from the shape of the lids that when open they would be large, larger in proportion to the face than any human eye he had ever examined. In that moment they were closed, and the face was, he says, still. 3 other people were in the room. A medical officer he knew slightly, from another unit, 2 men in civilian clothes whose names he was never given. They were watching the cot. The room had the quality of silence that arrives when everyone in it is waiting for something specific. Buckner was told to check the pulse. He approached and found it eventually, at the wrist, or what passed for the wrist, a faint and irregular rhythm, slow in a way that troubled him, but present. He reported this. The men in civilian clothes nodded. No one spoke beyond that. For the next hour and 40 minutes, nothing happened. He stood. He checked the pulse at intervals. He maintained his field notes. The being on the cot did not move. Its chest rose and fell in a pattern that was not quite the pattern of human breathing. Longer between breaths, shallower, like a system drawing on reserves it could not replenish. Then, sometime around 4 in the morning, the eyes opened. Buckner describes this on the tape with a pause of approximately 12 seconds before he continues, the longest single pause in the recording. When he resumes, his voice is flat, stripped of affect in the way voices sometimes go flat, when the memory being described is one the speaker has spent years pressing down. The eyes were black. That is the description that appears across the documented record, from every witness who has been close enough to say, and it is the description Buckner gives. Not dark brown, not very dark. Black entirely, without visible iris or pupil, like the eye was the same surface all the way through, like looking into something with no bottom. The being looked at the ceiling first, then at the 2 men in civilian clothes, then at Buckner. He was not prepared for what looking back felt like. He tries to describe it twice on the tape, abandoning the first attempt. The second produces this. It was not like being looked at. It was like being read. Like something going through him. The looking was not coming from across the room, but from inside his chest, inside his thinking, somewhere upstream of language. Barney Hill described something close to this in a regression session with Dr. Benjamin Simon in 1964. I felt as though his eyes were pushing into my eyes, Hill said, not looking at me, pushing. Buckner had no access to those transcripts when he made his recording in 1999. The correspondence between the 2 descriptions is not borrowed. It is arrived at separately, from the inside out, by 2 men in 2 different decades, with no means of comparing notes. The grey looked at Buckner for several seconds. Then it moved. Not dramatically, not in any way that brought the other men in the room to attention. The head turned, by perhaps 30 degrees, tracking toward him with a slowness that suggested deliberateness rather than effort. The 2 men in civilian clothes were watching the cot, but they were watching the sheet, watching the general outline of what lay beneath it. They were not watching Buckner. Whatever passed between the being and the medic in those next few seconds passed between them alone. Then something happened that Buckner says, on the tape, he has never been able to account for with any word in any language he knows. He knew something, not the way you know something you have been told. Not the way you know something studied over time. The way you know your own name. An immediate and total knowing, delivered into him without preparation or consent, radiating outward in every direction before he had any means of receiving or refusing it. What he knew was this: the being was aware that it was dying. It had been aware of this since before the room, since before the retrieval. He believed this, though he acknowledges the interpretation may be his own, layered over the transfer. What arrived in him was not a sentence, it was a fact, direct and complete, with no surrounding language and no translation required. The being was dying, and it knew, and it had chosen in the last coherent minutes available to it to place that knowledge somewhere it could survive. If you're hooked on this story, make sure to subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss an upload. Your support means everything and helps me bring you more emotional stories like this one. That is what Buckner says on the tape, that the grey spoke only once, not with a mouth, not with words, not in any direction that could be observed by anyone else in the room. It spoke only to him, he believes, because he had been the one who was close, because he had placed his hands on it to find the pulse, and in doing so had closed a circuit of some kind that the others in the room had kept open by standing back. The two men in civilian clothes did not react. Buckner looked at the medical officer, and the medical officer was watching the wall. Nobody else in the room had experienced anything, or if they had, they gave no sign. Buckner stood with what he had been given and did not move for what he estimates was 30 seconds. Then he went back to monitoring the pulse. The being died at 4:37 in the morning. The pulse simply ceased. No visible distress, no physical change he could document. The chest stopped moving and did not start again. He marked the time in his field notes. Those notes were taken from him before he left the building. A man he had not seen before appeared at the door within minutes of the time of death, as though he had been positioned just outside and waiting for exactly this signal, and he collected the notes and every form Buckner had filled out through the night. Buckner asked for a receipt. The man said, with a quality of calm that Buckner found more unsettling than any raised voice, that there would not be a receipt. He was driven back to his quarters. Before he could exit the vehicle, the colonel who had brought him said the events of that night were classified, that Buckner had witnessed nothing beyond a routine aircraft recovery operation, and that his family and his career would be best served by his thorough understanding of this fact. The colonel did not raise his voice. The calm was the only threat that was ever needed, Buckner says on the tape. He understood it then, and he carried that understanding for the next 53 years without putting it down once. He was never formally debriefed. 3 weeks after his transfer, a man he did not know telephoned his quarters in Georgia, asked him by name whether he had any further information to report from the night in question, and when Buckner said no, thanked him and hung up. That call is the last official contact he documents in any form. After that, nothing. The absence of follow-up inquiry is itself something to sit with, not what you would expect if what he had witnessed were genuinely insignificant. He was transferred within the month, assigned to a posting in Georgia, and from there his military record proceeds along lines that appear, in what survives of it, entirely unremarkable. He left the army in 1951. He married in 1953. He worked in civilian medical supply in the Albuquerque area for 30 years. He gardened. He raised his children. He attended church on Sundays. The silence, his daughter said later, was not the silence of a man who had nothing to say. Patricia Buckner Cross found, after his death, a box in the closet of his study. Inside it was a folded piece of paper, handwritten, dated July of 1989. 42 years after the fact, he had written down what the being had given him. Not the words, because there were no words, but a translation of the knowing. What he understood, in that lit room at 4 a.m, to be the content of the Grey's final communication. The paper says 3 things, transcribed in Tate's monograph. We have been here longer than the record you keep. We are not what you are looking for when you look for us. What we are is older than that question. 3 sentences. Buckner spent 42 years arriving at 3 sentences, and he notes on the paper itself that he is not certain any of them are exactly right. The language, he writes, was not made for translating. The closest he can get is what is on the page. The original is somewhere he cannot follow anymore. What makes the account difficult to dismiss is the specificity of its texture, the exact time noted against a lifelong habit of checking the watch, the prefabricated annex set back 70 yards from the main facility, the receipt that was refused, the colonel's measured tone, the interval between the being's breaths, the quality of the pulse at the wrist. These are not the details of a constructed narrative. They are the details of memory, specific, sensory, and slightly inconvenient, the way real memory always is. Jesse Marcel, the Army intelligence officer among the first to inspect the debris field northwest of Roswell, told his son before his death in 1986 that the material he handled that week was unlike anything in his experience, and that the speed of the official retrieval had troubled him for the rest of his career. He said, on record, that he had never been able to reconcile what he saw with what he was ordered to say he had seen. The gap between those two things, Marcel said, was where the truth lived. Glenn Dennis, an Albuquerque mortician who described receiving a call from the Roswell base in July of 1947 requesting small hermetically sealed caskets, spoke in the early 1990s of a nurse at the base who told him she had been present at an examination and described the beings in terms consistent with what Buckner would record decades later and independently. The nurse in Dennis's account was transferred out of Roswell within days of that conversation. Her name appears in Army records through July of 1947 and then simply stops. No transfer documentation, no subsequent posting. A record with a window missing precisely where the window would matter most. Buckner's account sits inside this pattern without straining to reach it. He does not claim to know what the beings were or where they came from. He does not claim the communication answered any question larger than the one it contained. He claims only that something was dying, and that it chose to speak, and that what it placed in him, in the wordless and direct and irreversible way it did this, was something he spent the rest of his life unable to put into language a person could carry without losing most of it. The tape Tate describes is not in any university archive. It is not in any government repository. According to the last entry in Tate's monograph, it is in a safe deposit box in the Albuquerque area, held by Patricia Buckner Cross, who has not given interviews and who, the last time Tate reached her in 2005, said only that she was still deciding what to do with it. Patricia, in her final letter to Tate, writes that she asked her father once, years before the tape was made, whether he believed in God. He told her he was no longer certain what God meant, but that he was sure the universe was older and more populated than anything he had been raised to expect. He said this quietly, as if it were not a large statement, and changed the subject. She did not understand what he meant until she heard the tape. What was placed inside Raymond Dale Buckner in that room was not proof. It was not evidence in any form that could be filed or preserved or subjected to analysis. It was a fact, placed in a person, carried in that person for 53 years, and finally set down in 3 sentences on a folded piece of paper in 1989, and on a cassette tape in 1999, and in a monograph printed and distributed to a small number of people in 2003. The chain of transmission is imperfect at every link. The chain exists. We have been here longer than the record you keep. We are not what you are looking for when you look for us. What we are is older than that question. If that is what was placed inside a 24-year-old medic in New Mexico in the early morning of July 8, 1947, then it was not placed there to be proven. The physical record was already being collected at the door. The notes were already on their way to wherever notes like that go. The beings appear to have understood this, or anticipated it, and to have chosen a container that could not be confiscated. Not a document, not a photograph, a person. A 24-year-old Army medic who would live another 53 years in the silence he had been instructed to keep, who would eventually break that silence alone in a room with a borrowed cassette recorder, and who would leave behind 3 sentences on a folded piece of paper in a box in a closet for his daughter to find. Buckner managed it, at the end, in the only language he had. Thank you so much for watching until the end. If you loved this story, check out the other videos on your screen now. I think you'll really enjoy them. And don't forget to subscribe if you haven't already. See you in the next story.